Right, can you all hear me? Yes? Yes, even to the back? Ok. C'est bon pour l'enregistrement? Ok. So hello, good evening to all. My name is Marion Naugrette-Fournier. Some of you know me, especially those who've been attending the Méthodologie de la recherche en traduction seminar. So our session today is meant to be, if I can make this work, will it work? Will it? Yes. Yes. Is meant to be both an introduction to translation studies, so from a theoretical and practical point of view, and a presentation of my own research in translation studies for the past few years. Its aim is to provide you with basic notions and guidelines for further reading and studies in the developing field of translation studies. So some of the major theories of translation will be broached, beginning with the very origin of translation. And so next week, we'll have the great pleasure and honor of welcoming here Laetitia Deveau, who is the current translator in residence at the Centre Culturel Irlandais de Paris. And her 6-month residency is funded by the Conseil Régional d'Île-de-France. She's especially renowned for her French translation of works by Sally Rooney, so Conversations with Friends, Beautiful World, Where Are You, and Intermezzo last year, Sebastian Barry and Emma McBride. She's also currently carrying out both a translation project and a personal writing project, and I think she'll talk about it next time, so here she is. So I think it's a really unique opportunity for you to discover the living practice of a literary translation and engage with a real flesh and blood professional translator. So what I would like you to do for next time is each of you prepare a question for Laetitia Deveau, okay? Because she's quite anxious. She's not used to amphi like this. And well, it's very kind of her to come here. So please prepare questions for her. I think she'll be ready to answer most of them. Right, so now what is translation? So the word translation, which was first attested in around 1314, derives from the Old French and from the translation, and from the Latin translatio, which meant to transport, to move, physically speaking, okay? And in French, the verb traduire has replaced the old verb, the former word, which was translater, in fact, okay, since 1639, so since the 16th century. And it came from the Latin word traducere, which meant carry through or carry beyond, okay? And the words traducteur and traduction, meaning translator and translating, of course, were introduced in 1540. Intraduisible appeared in 1687, and a translateur was used in French until the end of the 18th century, okay? But it meant a poor translator, okay? Not a good translator. And traduction, which first meant translating, later referred to the translated text, or what we would call the target text, okay, thanks to a kind of metonymical process in the 16th century as well, okay? So as Jeremy Munday defines it in his seminal work, Introducing Translation Studies, in 2001, the word translation today, as we know it, has several meanings. So first, the general subject field or phenomenon, such as I studied translation at university. B, the product, that is, say, the text that has been translated. For instance, they published the Arabic translation of the report. And C, the process of producing the translation, otherwise known as translating, such as a translation service. Okay, so the subject, the general subject field, the product, and the process of producing the translation. Okay? If I'm going too fast, please raise your hand and I can go a bit slower. So then translation is also what we could call, sorry, a basic linguistic activity and the essence of all communication arts. Everyone translates without realizing it as soon as they communicate. We encode and decode a message constantly while we speak. Okay, and this is a quotation, some of you know him already, but from a very famous linguist called Roman Jakobson, in a very famous essay on linguistic aspects of translation, where he said, the translator recodes and transmits a message from another source. And so in a conversation, interpretation is as active as speech. When you listen to somebody speaking, you will decipher the signs you've received, that is to say, the sounds, okay? And you will translate them into meaningful information about the content or the intent of the other person, using the knowledge, of course, of one's language, but also the aids derived from other elements, such as the tone of the voice or the body movements, okay? And we French people are famous for our body movements, okay, for instance. And of course, the context, the context is also an essential aid which counterbalances lexical ambiguities. So here you have, of course, the example, la porte est ouverte, and c'est un homme ouvert. Okay, so only the context can help you to decide. Or blue paint and blue blood is another example. So although the semantic fields of most words are always much greater than the meanings which are relevant in a specific context, communication is not prevented thanks to the context, okay? So when one writes, one translates the oral word into a written sign, which is then decoded by the reader, again using contextual information situated in the rest of the text. So this is an instance of translation from one system, an oral system, to another, a written system, within the same language. And so I'm sorry for my students who've already heard this, but I think it's important for the other master students. But I have to tell you, of course, about Roman Jakobson's 3 categories of translation. And Madame Sansonetti was very pleased because she says to me, well, apparently at least some of them know something about the 3 categories of translation by Jakobson, okay? So I was quite glad about this. So in the article I just mentioned, he defines, and this is very important, okay, 3 categories of translation. So first, what he calls intralingual or rewording, rephrasing also what you have said in the same language but using other words, often simpler words if, you know, just your first utterance has failed to come across. And as teachers, we constantly do this. Or with children, for instance, okay, when you have to explain to them again and again using different words, this is intralingual or rewording, intralingual translation. Then we have interlingual or translation proper, okay? So the kind of translation we'll talk about today, that is to say when 2 or more different languages are involved, and then intersemiotic, or what he calls transmutation. That is to say, interpreting linguistic signs through non-linguistic signs. For instance, a film adaptation of a novel or a ballet. So what we're going to discuss in this course is a limited definition of translation, because we will only focus on interlingual translation, okay? So interlingual translation, that is to say, when the reader of what we call in translation studies the target text, donc le texte cible, okay, the translated text, is written in a different verbal language, which is the target language. We say TL also. And so it is then that the source, the target language and the target text meet the original or the source text, le texte de source in French, written in the source language, or SL. Is it clear for everyone? Yes? Okay. No questions so far? Okay, it's a cours magistral, but I mean, you can interrupt me. There's not a problem at all, okay? So now I'm going to talk about where translation began exactly, and so we'll go back in time, okay? And in ancient Egypt to begin with, and then Mesopotamia, okay? So first of all, translation in ancient Egypt, okay? So as you know, ancient Egypt, or the Pharaonic civilization, lasted from minus 3000 to minus 332 BC, when Alexander the Great arrived in Egypt. And you couldn't say there were translators, but there used to be interpreters in ancient Egypt. And there are some inscriptions in here. So it's a necropolis facing the Elephantine Island. So you can see it here on the picture in Aswan. And in this necropolis, we found inscriptions mentioning interpreters. Okay. And so, although the Egyptians tended to consider the other people and their languages as barbarians, okay, they were still obliged to keep political and economical relationships with them, hence the need for interpreters, okay? And be very careful, of course, because the word barbarian did not have the same connotation as today, okay? Because barbaros in Greek means simply the other, okay, but not, it has nothing to do with something barbaric or torture or whatever. Okay, it simply meant the other. And the Greek historian Herodotus wrote in his writings that in the middle of the 5th century BC, the Egyptians were divided into 7 social classes, and among them the class of the interpreters. Okay, so this is the first mention we have of the translators, or what could look like a translator. So then we'll go to Mesopotamia. Okay, translation and Mesopotamia. So here is what was Mesopotamia at that time. Okay, and so again, I'll come back to this because Mesopotamia was divided into 2 main regions. Okay, so you had Assyria in the north and Babylonia in the south, and of course the capital was Babylon. Okay, which is 85 kilometers south of Baghdad in Iraq. And so in the middle of the 19th century, the Assyrian civilization was discovered through the excavations of Paul-Émile Botta and Austin Henry Layard. And there was an important amount of research around, made on the languages that were used by this civilization. Among them, you have it here, Sumerian, donc le sumérien, okay, which was older. And then you had also Akkadian, donc l'Akkadien, which had been strongly influenced by Sumerian, okay? So Akkadian was a Semitic, could you close the door, please? Thank you. Akkadian was a Semitic language, contrary to Sumerian, which was an Asian language. And the Sumerian language was not only used for trading purposes, it was also used for the writings of famous legends, such as, maybe you've heard of it, the legend or the epic of Gilgamesh. So Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk, and this poem, the epic of Gilgamesh, donc l'épopée de Gilgamesh, is a poem that is considered as the first great work of literature, even before Homer's Odyssey, okay? So then in the 3rd millennium BC, the northern cities of Mesopotamia were joined into a single kingdom, the kingdom of Akkad. And the use of Akkadian became commonplace and replaced Sumerian. Hence, the development of a very intimate and cultural symbiosis between the Sumerians and the Akkadians, which included also, and this becomes interesting, widespread bilingualism. People had to speak both Sumerian and Akkadian. And so the Akkadian civilization relied heavily on the Sumerian culture and wished to preserve the richness of the Sumerian language. Therefore, the Akkadians invented the first bilingual dictionaries from Sumerian to Akkadian. And of course, a dictionary is a form of translation. Okay? And this is a quotation from a very famous book by Georges Mounin, Les problèmes théoriques de la traduction, a great classic. Certains donnent l'idéogramme, so certains means the dictionaries. Certains donnent l'idéogramme sumérien, sa transcription phonétique en akkadien, sa traduction akkadienne. Parfois même, outre cette traduction, figure une explication par un synonyme ou une définition. Okay, so this was one of the first examples of translation through a dictionary. Okay, and so the discovery of Mesopotamian civilizations by Europe during the 19th century is to be related to the larger frame of what Michel Ballard, in his Histoire de la traduction, called the diachronic translation, donc la traduction diachronique. Okay? That is to say, they realized in the 19th century that there was a cultural past that had been lost and that they needed to retrieve it thanks to translators. Okay? So now we'll leave Mesopotamia and we'll go to Greece, translation in ancient Greece. Right. So Greece, as we all know, is considered to be the cradle of Western civilizations, where all major forms of literature were born, and afterwards its writings were widely copied, imitated, and translated, of course. And surprisingly, the Greeks have not translated very much, given the fact that their country was the country of the origins, if you want, okay? And in Greece, translation, in fact, might have been placed under the aegis of the god Hermes, donc Hermès, okay? And the name Hermes means interpreter or messenger. So this is the reason why Hermes is also considered as the god of translators as well. He's a messenger, he's an interpreter, okay? So he was the god of eloquence, but also the god of negotiations, the god of travels, okay? And of course, those meanings have been symbolically used in writings on translation, okay? However, despite Greece's position as a crossroads in the Mediterranean for trade and for linguistic exchanges, translation has been widely neglected by the Greeks, okay? So the Greeks, like the Egyptians, considered the other people as barbarians, as I said, and felt they possessed a culture and a language that were immensely superior to all others, okay? So, however, the term, as I've just mentioned, barbarian did not have such a derogatory connotation at the time as it does now, as historian Jacques Lacarrière reminds us of, and I quote him, le terme barbare avait un sens proprement linguistique. Et donc c'était encore plus précis que l'autre, hein, c'était même celui, au départ, qui ne parle pas grec ou ne comprend pas le grec. Donc c'était un sens très limité, d'accord? So there are, however, some exceptions to this form of ethnocentrism. And one is in a dialogue by Plato, so the Greek philosopher Plato, and the other in Herodotus' writings. But first, Plato, okay? So Plato, born in minus 428 in Athens, went to Egypt around minus 390. And maybe it's the reminder of this trip that led him to relate in two of his dialogues. You know that he wrote dialogues, okay? And one is the Timaeus and the other one the Critias, okay? And he related in both dialogues the relationships between the Greeks and the Egyptians, okay? And what they owed the Egyptians on a cultural point of view, which was quite rare, okay, given the prejudice of the Greeks about the other people. and the other countries in general. And in those two dialogues, Critias evokes the trip that a Greek businessman, Solon, made in Egypt around minus 600, as well as the story that an Egyptian priest had told him about the legend of Atlantis. Okay, and this is how we know that about the legend of Atlantis in this dialogue. And this story, as told by Solon, is in fact a translation, okay, a translation from Greek, okay, from Egyptian to Greek, okay, but even as Bala puts it, it is a form of translation appropriation, donc traduction et appropriation à la fois, as the proper nouns are translated into Greek, okay, in Plato's dialogue. You will not find the proper nouns in Egyptian, but in Greek, okay. So now the other exception, the Greek historian Herodotus. So Herodotus' case is interesting because, first of all, he was born in minus 484 in Halicarnassus, which is today in Turkey, and settled in Samos, which is a Greek island off the coast of Asia Minor, very close to Turkey. So is it perhaps because he did not come from Greece originally? You know, he was not a Greek from the Peloponnese, from Athens, etc. Perhaps this is the reason why he did not share the same prejudice towards the barbarians as his contemporaries did, although he used that distinction, okay? And as to translation, Herodotus' writings contain some kind of translation, as apparently there had been some sort of transcription into Greek of some information originally written or formulated in Egyptian. And this is a quote from Hérodote. Jusqu'ici, j'ai dit ce que j'avais vu, jugé et recherché par moi-même. Je vais maintenant rapporter des récits égyptiens tels que je les ai entendus. Il s'y ajoutera pourtant quelques observations personnelles. So, this means that either someone in Egypt translated, okay, those stories and tales from Egypt to him, or that maybe he understood Egyptian. We cannot rule out this possibility. And now, and this is really where translation gets serious, so to speak, the Hebrew text and the translation of the Bible. Do you have questions? No? Right. So what we call actually the Hebrew text at the beginning was not known under a written form, but derived from the oral tradition of the Jewish people. And in 587, Nebuchadnezzar, so the king of Babylon, as you know, destroyed Jerusalem and took with him most of the population into exile, which also implied the destruction of the sacred texts, unfortunately. However, as Judea was integrated into the Persian Empire in 538, the province became more autonomous, which allowed its people to write the sacred texts and keep them forever thanks to the written form. And the sacred texts were divided into several groups, and among them the Torah, la Torah. That is the law according to the Hebrew canon. And the Torah itself was made of 5 books, which the Catholics will later call the Pentateuch, le Pentateuch, okay, because penta in Greek means 5. So in Greek, this means, le Pentateuch means the 5 scrolls, because they were scrolls, okay? So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So translation and language are essential issues in the Bible. First of all, because the Torah is a sacred text, and because of this, it entails a form of linguistic prejudice, okay? I mean, how can you translate a sacred text without betraying it in a way, okay? And so you will find translation and language all over the Bible, even at the beginning, of course, because we have the celebration of the creative power of God's language, God's words, remember, are performative. They create what they name, okay? And God said, let there be light, and there was light, okay? So all biblical quotations in English here are from the Authorized Version. So the first one, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. This is in St. John, okay? So French translation, but a Protestant one. Au commencement était la parole. So an interesting translation of the word. Et la parole était avec Dieu. Elle était au commencement avec Dieu. Toutes choses ont été faites par elle, et rien de ce qui a été fait n'a été fait sans elle. En elle était la vie, et la vie était la lumière des hommes. Dans la Bible de Jérusalem, pour le culte catholique, au commencement était le Verbe. Okay, so another translation for word. Et le Verbe auprès de Dieu, et le Verbe était Dieu. Il était au commencement auprès de Dieu, tout fut par lui, et sans lui rien ne fut. Ce qui fut en lui était la vie, et la vie était la lumière des hommes. Okay. So God is the one responsible for naming things, and this responsibility he shares with man. So if you go back to Genesis at the beginning of the Bible, and God brought them, so the animals, unto Adam to see what he would call them. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof. And this sparked, much later on in the Middle Ages, a very famous debate between what was called the nominalists and the realists in the Middle Ages. Donc les nominalistes et les réalistes, okay? So here I will quote Moulin again. Pour les réalistes issus de Platon et de Saint-Augustin, les mots sont des manifestations concrètes des idées. Il y a un rapport intrinsèque entre l'idée et le mot. Pour les nominalistes, qui procèdent d'Aristote et de saint Thomas plus tard, les idées n'ont de réalité que dans l'esprit des hommes. Les mots ne sont pas les choses, ni les germes des choses, mais ne sont que des noms. Et les noms ne sont tels que par convention. Okay. So this was a very, very heated debate in the Middle Ages where there was no winner, okay? And this is a debate still going on in philosophy today. But of course, this had an impact on translation, as you can imagine, okay? And as you know, in Genesis, God transfers to Adam the task of naming things. And whatsoever Adam called every living creature, that was the name thereof, okay? But for the nominalists, this is wrong, because les mots ne sont pas les choses, okay? Which is quite unsettling in a way. So this means that how can we then translate a sacred text such as the Torah, which you can see here, one of the oldest examples we have, okay? So the Torah being a sacred text, of course, implies that we cannot have direct access to its meaning, which means the text must be scrutinized in order to grasp its significance, hence the development of the science of hermeneutics, donc l'herméneutique, okay, giving birth to several commentaries such as the Talmud, donc le Talmud. Still, the defiance towards translation is extreme when the translation of the Torah is considered because of the fear of distorting the word of God, giving rise to very literal translations, such as the one by Aquila, which is very difficult to read. And there is also the opinion that as the Torah was written in Hebrew, therefore Hebrew is the mother tongue, a noble language, or a sacred language even, and that if you translate the Bible into another language, such as Greek, for example, you will commit a sacrilege. And a good example of this might be the myth of Babel in the Torah. Maybe you'll remember, or in the Bible, the story of Babel, okay? So this was when all men spoke the same language before. They wanted at one point to build a tower so high that it would penetrate the skies. And God punished them by quote, confounding their language that they may not understand one another's speech. So I'll quote the Bible again. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. And this is one of the many representations that have been made of the tower, Babel's tower. Okay, and so Babel, the episode of Babel is the major biblical episode for translators because it recalls how humankind fell into linguistic diversity because of God's anger, God's wrath at seeing men's hubris, men's vanity, evidenced by their plan to build such a high tower. And on the other hand, since Babel, the translator has been the one who, to some extent, can remedy this scattering, this diversity of tongues, and in a way alleviate God's punishment, placing him in the position of a redeemer. So, so far, no scientific evidence has pointing towards the existence of a unified language at one point in mankind's development. Okay, so there was this whole myth of a kind of proto-Indo-European PIE language, but in fact, it's a mere linguistic construct and only takes into account a very limited group of Indo-European languages. There is Esperanto as well. Okay. So, however, the myth of Babel has really fascinated linguists and translators all through ages. German romantics, post-romantics such as Humboldt, Goethe, Heidegger, the German philosopher, or Walter Benjamin have wanted to believe in a primordial language, a pure language, so to speak, dating back to pre-Babylonian times, a language which could be regained through translation. And in the field of translation studies, at least three major books explicitly refer to it. So George Steiner's very famous work, After Babel, in 1975, Jacques Derrida's Des Tours de Babel in 1980, Georges Berman's Les Tours de Babel, and of course Georges Mounin, Les problèmes théoriques de la traduction. But, I mean, from the theological point of view, the act of translating was considered as a form of transgression, as it goes against the ban on communication and as it might convey a meaning supposed to be untranslatable or so complex that it could be inevitably betrayed in translation. And so then translation became actually a blasphemy. And George Steiner recalls an anecdote, well, we don't know if it's true or not, okay, in his book, I quote, Le Megillah Ta'anit, donc un traité rabbinique qu'on estime remonter au 1er siècle, rapporte que le monde s'obscurcit pendant 3 jours quand la loi, avec un grand L, fut traduite en grec. Ce qui est évidemment un peu beaucoup, mais et on ne sait pas si cela s'est produit, mais c'est pour vous dire un petit peu vraiment cette notion de transgression hein, et d'acte sacrilège qu'était la traduction hein, au départ. Alors, il a bien fallu la traduire quand même, la Bible, hein, vous vous en doutez. Et donc, maintenant, je vais vous parler un petit peu des traducteurs de la Bible, les premiers traducteurs de la Bible, hein, et donc de ceux qu'on a appelés la Septante, d'accord? Donc, c'est the Septuagint. Donc en anglais. So, a little bit of history first in order to understand what I'm about to tell you. So when Alexander the Great died in -323, the empire was divided among his 4 generals, known in Latin as the Diadochi, so meaning successors, one of them being Ptolemy, donc Ptolémée, okay, who seized Egypt, Palestine, Cilicia, Petra, and Cyprus. And thus he began the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, which lasted until the death of Cleopatra in 31 BC. And so Greek language introduced Greek literature into the former Persian Empire because of Ptolemy. And the same held true for the area known as Palestine at that time, where Greek literature found its way into the religious thought and scripture of Judaism. And on a cultural plane, Ptolemy I started the creation of, and you have it here on the left, the great library at Alexandria in Egypt, which has been unfortunately destroyed, and contributed to the development of the humanities and science in general, thanks to this extraordinary library. And his son, Ptolemy II, followed into his footsteps and had a translation of the Torah into Greek being made, known as the Septuagint, la Septante, from the Latin, which means 70. Why 70? I'll tell you in a few minutes. So why did he decide to sponsor the translation of the Torah? Okay, because he was of Greek origin. So two possible reasons. First of all, intellectual curiosity and the need to better understand and communicate with the Jewish community in Alexandria, which was very important at that time. And the second one being that, so because of this need to communicate with the Jewish community, he asked, according to a text known as the Letter of Aristeas, donc la lettre d'Aristée, written in the 2nd century BC, so I quote, 72 elderly, so not 70, but 72, elderly and virtuous scholars would have translated the text of the Torah in 72 days. Okay, so 70, 72, well, history has registered 70, la Septante, but there were apparently 72 translators. So this is a quotation from the Tractate Megillah, which describes the story of this extraordinary endeavor, translating endeavor. King Ptolemy once gathered 72 elders. He placed them in 72 chambers, each of them in a separate one, without revealing to them why they were summoned. He entered each one's room and said, "Write for me the Torah of Moshe, your teacher." God put it in the heart of each one to translate identically as all the others did. Okay. So nowadays, the term Septuagint refers to the whole of the first translation of the Old Testament into Greek, which has been made between the 3rd and the 1st century BC by several translators, among them the Septuagint. And according to some historians, this translation might in fact be a legend. It is highly probable, in fact. And the text of the Septuagint would be the result, in fact, of several translations. And of course, also the quality and style of the translators of the Septuagint also varied considerably from book to book, from the literal to paraphrasing to interpretative. Nevertheless, although in the synagogues the Septuagint was not immediately adopted, the first Christians considered the Septuagint as a fundamental text. Okay, so we don't know if it's a legend or not, but nevertheless, it was considered as a fundamental text. And I'd like to show you here an extract from, I don't know if you've seen that movie which was made in 2020, Les Traducteurs, de Régis Roinsard, but if you're interested, I strongly suggest you to have a look at it. So I'll just show you a short extract. Sorry for the commercials before. It's a thriller, by the way, but a thriller about translation. So, sorry, this is about something else. And then we'll have the real one. This is not about the Septuagint at all, okay? As you can see. Right. So you'll decide if you want to watch Frankenstein But so, oh, I don't know if he has the sound sign.
Vous avez fait bon voyage?
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very proud to announce the final book of the Daedalus trilogy, The Man Who Did Not Want to Die.
C'est un best-seller mondial.
Translation will begin in December.
T'es prêt à enfermer tes traducteurs dans un bunker, à les traiter comme du bétail.
Vous avez fait bon voyage? Vous ne pourrez garder aucune trace de votre passage ici.
Ma confiance, reine.
Ce travail commun de traduction pour une sortie mondiale simultanée est une première. Vous pouvez vous estimer chanceux. Après vous. Nous avons pris toutes les précautions du monde. Isoler les traducteurs, confisquer les portables, couper Internet.
Это не просто триллер. Это фундаментальный текст.
Les 10 premières pages de Daedalus tome 3 ne t'appartiennent plus si tu ne verses pas la somme d'ici 24 heures. 100 pages supplémentaires apparaîtront demain sur la toile.
I mean, look at us. We're in prison down here.
Però il bastardo che ci sta fregando, io lo ammazzo.
Τουλάχιστον ο hacker μας απάλλαξε από αυτό. 下一步是什么？好棒棒！
Moi je les ai des histoires. Je vais le prouver. Je n'arrête pas de le lire. Tu dois comprendre comment tu as fait.
So this is a modern version of the Septuagint. Okay, it's I mean translation can cost you dearly, even your own life, but it's a very good movie. So if you haven't seen it, I strongly recommend it. So now, before the break, our last dive into the past with Saint Jerome's, so in English we say Jerome really, yeah? Saint Jerome's translation of the biblical text, okay? And he was maybe considered as the first translation theorist of all times, apart from being a saint, right? So several translations were made, as you know, of the Gospels, which are only a part of the New Testament. And as you know, the New Testament is made of 27 books, reunited in several series: the Gospels, the Epistles, the Acts of the Apostles, and the Book of Revelation, or Apocalypse. And so the scriptures, les Écritures, or the Gospels, are a work of art of a new kind at the time, offering, as you know, 4 points of view on the life of a hero, Jesus, who brings alongside with him the good news. And the Gospel means, so good and spell in English, meaning good news or glad tidings, is the translation of the Greek word evangelion, the good news, in French, l'évangile. Donc on a l'évangile selon, comme vous le savez, Saint Matthieu, Saint Marc, Saint Luc et Saint Jean. So one of the most famous translations of the New Testament, but also of the Old Testament and other religious texts, was the translation realized by Jerome, Saint Jérôme in French. He was, but he is still today a most prominent figure in the history of translation. He was learned, he was a true connoisseur of classical pagan literature, he studied theology and languages, and he translated a huge amount of religious texts and expressed also his views on translation in prefaces, and especially in his famous letter to Pamachius, La Lettre à Pamac, which is considered as one of the earliest treatises on the art of translation. So he was born, so Jerome was born in 347 AD at Stridon in Dalmatia, today it's Western Croatia, in a family of wealthy landowners. He then went to study in Rome to pursue rhetorical and philosophical studies, but a major spiritual crisis led him to devote his life to Christ. And in 373-74, he decided to go to Orient to live in monasteries. So first he settled in Antioch, then he went to the desert of Chalcis, where he lived as a hermit and an anchorite. En français, on dit un anachorète. D'accord? So this is a very famous painting, okay, of Jerome, reading in the countryside by the famous painter Giovanni Bellini, and there were many, many paintings made of Jerome. And there, in the desert, in a grotto, more specifically, he studied the scriptures and languages such as Greek or Hebrew. He was ordained as a priest, but he asked to remain a monk to preserve his independence, okay? Soon afterwards, he went to Constantinople to pursue a study of scripture under Gregory Nazianzen, Grégoire de Nice, and that he went to Rome again as secretary to Pope Damasus I and the leading Roman Christians. Okay, so you see how they traveled extensively at the time and how long it must have taken him, you know, to go to Constantinople, then Rome again, and back and forth. And so his knowledge of Greek and his readings of text written in Greek induced him to translate them, wishing them to become widely known. And when he was in Rome, he was given duties by Pope Damasus, and he undertook a revision of the Latin Bible, donc la Vetus Latina, to be based on the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. So, of course, at the time, the ideal translation remained the Septuagint, one and only translated text, as well as one original text, and the diversity of interpretation might imply the alteration of the divine text, as we have seen. However, the idea of modernizing the language and upgrading the style of the whole was also part of the project, because the translation of the Septuagint was very literal, okay? So in 385, he decided to go back to Orient, followed by some friends. They visited Jerusalem, Bethlehem, and the holy places of Galilee, and there went to Egypt. And later, in the summer of 386, he was back in Palestine and spent the remainder of his life in a cave near Bethlehem, the very cave where supposedly Jesus was born. Okay, this is a supposition, of course. And he led a life of incessant activity in literary production. Okay, so here we have another beautiful painting of him with a lion. I don't know if you remember why he's often represented with a lion. It's a very famous episode in the Bible. No one? Why a lion? No, because a lion at one point supposedly went to him because he had something in his paw which was hurting him, and Jerome removed the thing that was hurting the lion in his paw. And from then, the lion became his friend. Okay, so this is why he always represented with a lion on the paintings. So then, although he was in a cave, okay, he led a life of incessant activity and in literary production, and to these last 34 years of his career belong the most important of his works, among them his version of the Old Testament from the original Hebrew text, and his retranslation of the New Testament based on the Greek text. And with the translation of Jerome, the Western Christians discovered the principle of exegesis, donc ce qu'on appelle l'exégèse, and most of all, the scandal of retranslation. It was the first time that someone ever retranslated the New Testament. And so his retranslation of the New Testament did not receive a good welcome at all, because it broke with the tradition and very simply with the text that the audience was accustomed. So he received very negative reports, which he heard about from St. Augustine in his letters, although St. Augustine was a friend, but he was very critical. As to the Old Testament, the work that Jerome has accomplished is really most remarkable and can already be considered as part of a humanist perspective, although you will not hear the word humanist for several centuries from then. So to Jerome, retranslation as a translation technique comes from a comparative process. Donc c'est vraiment une procédure comparatiste avant la lettre. No? And is the final outcome of an ethical approach. And so the result, which was somewhat disturbing, aroused some suspicion, even among authorities such as Saint Augustine, donc Saint Augustin, le philosophe, okay, the very famous philosopher, to whom the Septuagint was an irrefutable text. You couldn't touch it. And thus he advised Jerome to beware of his hubris, of his vanity as a translator, which might lead him to believe that he was cleverer than all the previous translators before him. Okay? And according to St. Augustine, the multiplicity of interpretations couldn't be but harmful to the influence of the scriptures. And I quote St. Augustine, Or, à cette réflexion te contraindra la religion qui t'enseigne que l'autorité des divines écritures deviendra flottante si en elle chacun peut croire ce qu'il veut, mais ne pas croire ce qu'il ne veut pas. So this is a portrait of St. Augustine. And now we arrive to the letter to Firmicus itself, so Jerome's masterpiece, or first really treatise on translation. So in Latin, De Optimo Genere Interpretandi, on the best way of translating. So this letter, or treatise on translation, has not been directly written on his translation works on the Bible, even if he mentions at some point the issue of biblical translation. It was written in 395 because of the attacks and the strong criticism he suffered apropos his informal translation from Greek into Latin from a letter by the Bishop of Constantia to John, Bishop of Jerusalem. So it is addressed to Firmicus, who was a Roman senator and who also was a friend of St. Augustine. Okay? So it was not about the Bible. It was about a small translation matter, but in fact it was about much more than that. It was about his own freedom as a translator. So here you have his own words. Indeed, I not only admit, but freely proclaim that in translation, donc interpretatione in Latin from the Greek, except in the case of sacred scripture, where the very order of the word is a mystery, I render not word for word, but sense for sense. Donc je ne traduis pas, en fait, mot pour mot, mais c'est le sens qu'il traduit. Et évidemment, c'était quelque chose d'extrêmement moderne et révolutionnaire à l'époque. So Jerome here alludes to two different translation methods in his letter. First of all, what you might call, and what is still called today, the Ciceronian method, donc la méthode de Cicéron, the famous Latin orator, which allowed to take some liberties with the text. And the implicitly literal or word-for-word method, especially concerning the scriptures that we had with the Septuagint. However, the true subject of the letter is also the translation of Greek texts other than the scriptures. And he underlines the liberties taken by Cicero, induced by the diversity of languages. And he quotes the very famous passage of Cicero's preface and adds it to the words of Horace, the famous Latin poet, in his Ars Poetica, do not strive to render word for word like a faithful translator, donc interprète, which was the word used for translator at the time. Do not strive to render word for word like a faithful translator, okay? So he then gave specific examples, okay, and to illustrate the issue of the gap with the original text, okay, that even the Septuagint made, okay, and he even, in this letter, he even tackled several translation techniques, for instance, supplementation, which you know as étoffement, due to the word order. So to conclude, Jerome advocates a dynamic translation, aiming at clarity, while somewhat integrating the right to make mistakes, okay? And then after having reaffirmed the authority of the Septuagint's version, he reinforces his own modern position, okay? Underlining the imperatives of the target language and the target text. And this was one of the first time that someone spoke in favor of the target text and that you should adapt to a modern audience, a contemporary audience. And so this is why we may wonder if Jerome was the first translation theorist, in a way. And this is why also Jerome is the patron saint of translators, because well, his feast day is on the 30th of September, and it has become also the International Translation Day. And this is no wonder that they used his feast day to create the International Translation Day. So this is what I had to tell you about, and what I wanted to tell you about the origins of translation. So it's a lot in a short time, but now we'll make a short break before I introduce you to my own path as a researcher in translation studies. So shall we say perhaps 10 minutes? And we'll all reconvene in 10 minutes? Okay, thank you. So now to my least favorite part, because I don't like very much to talk about myself. But anyway, this was the way this course was conceived. So I have to talk about myself. So both as an academic and a translator. So I won't have time today to go into the details of my, let's say, professional activity as a translator, but rather as an academic interested in translation studies and Irish studies, because I'm specialized in both fields. So I've decided to do this in a light tone, okay? And this is the cliffs, the white cliffs of Dover, and I'll explain you why. Perhaps this is where all began. So I've always had a special love for languages, and first and foremost for English. Perhaps this is because my grandfather and my father were English teachers themselves, I have to admit. The former in secondary school and the latter at university. And so as a child, I spent many stays in England, first traveling by ferry from Calais. And so the sight here of the white cliffs of Dover or Folkestone always moved me deeply, even as a child, and I was not seasick, which was a good point. And so later, via the Channel Tunnel, shortly after it was opened in 1994. And so, of course, it was faster, but nevertheless, I missed the sea, the going from a place you could actually see and the going to or arriving to a place you could see as well, maybe because it meant you actually traveled from one country to another, but also from one language to another, which is also the back and forth movement you find in translation. And I must admit, I love trying to decipher the motorway signs as we drove through East Sussex, and then trying to order a nice. So my second really memorable experience with the English language was the fish and chips. So I was asked to order, for example, a very nice and tasty fish and chips in a country pub. And as Roman Jakobson puts it always in his famous essay, there is no signatum without signum, there is no meaning without the sign, or there is no signified without the signifier. Or to parody Jakobson's words, the meaning of the term fish and chips cannot be inferred from a non-linguistic acquaintance with actual fish and chips without the assistance of the verbal code. So this means, well, actually, as some of you know, he takes the example of camembert and cheese, and I take the example of fish and chips. But if you simply taste good fish and chips, served, you see, in old newspaper wrapping, just as it should be, you still need to know what it's called to grasp its full meaning. So conversely, if I had never gone to England and never tasted real fish and chips and only known the English term, would my understanding of it have been complete? This is an issue many translators must face, especially today when traveling has never been easier. You can go to England and taste fish and chips and not have merely a verbal acquaintance of the term. So later during college, middle school, so I pursued the study of English, followed by Latin, German, and ancient Greek. And I continued studying these languages for many years, including classe préparatoire, where I specialized in English, while also studying German and ancient Greek before entering the École Normale Supérieure in Paris in 2006. And well, at one point, I must confess, when I was in classe prépa, I briefly hesitated between specializing in English or in German, because I love German too, and my grandmother was half German, and well, I still have family in Germany, and I've always felt a particular fondness for the language. And so, yet English exerted a kind of overwhelming pull on me, and English won the contest, because it was during classe prépa that I discovered the world of English poetry, and I've never left it since. It has shifted slightly towards Irish poetry, as some of you know, over the years, which of course is still written in English, but now I also read poetry in Irish, which is a language that I have learned, and it still continues to fascinate me. Oddly enough, a researcher's path is always sinuous and far from being straight. I wrote my M1, which was still called a maîtrise at the time, on an American 21st century novelist called John Updike. And this was born out of a teenage passion I had for America. Right. But then during the year I prepared for the agrégation d'anglais, the poems of the renowned Irish poet W.B. Yeats were on the syllabus, and I fell in love with poetry and Ireland and Irish poetry at the very same time, and this time for good. So while completing my second master's degree, or M2 in Irish Studies at the Sorbonne Nouvelle, so we were not here, but in the 5th arrondissement at that time, I wrote my dissertation on Derek Mahon, who was a contemporary Northern Irish poet, and who suddenly passed away in October 2020. And I subsequently pursued a PhD on his poetic work, focusing particularly on his relationship with objects and materiality. And the title of my doctoral thesis was Pour une nouvelle histoire des objets, réévaluation, classement et recyclage dans l'œuvre poétique de Derek Mahon, which I defended here at the Sorbonne Nouvelle in December 2015. So you may then wonder, what about translation? And as a matter of fact, I dedicated an entire chapter of my PhD to the study of Mahon's translations of major European and non-European writers, including classical Greek and Roman thinkers, poets and playwrights such as Sophocles, Lucretius, Horace and Ovid, medieval French poets writing in Occitan, 17th or 18th century Irish poets writing in Irish, such as Tai O'Rourke, as well as contemporary Irish language poets such as Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill. And Mahon had a particular fondness for French poetry, having spent a year at the Sorbonne in 1965-1966, where he met a fellow Irishman who had also fallen in love with France, none other than Samuel Beckett. And this may partly explain the strong French presence in his translations, or adaptations, as he preferred to call them. And so here you have his book Adaptations, featuring poets such as Gérard de Nerval, Baudelaire, Rimbaud, Laforgue, Paul Valéry, and especially Philippe Jacotet, with whom he felt a kind of special poetic affinity. And he also translated poetry written in French by contemporary African poets, such as Jean-Baptiste Tati-Loutard, and in particular women poets as well, including Yvonne Bolumbu, who's still alive, and Monique Mbeka, who's still alive too. In addition, he translated works by renowned Japanese and Chinese poets, such as Matsuo Basho, who lived in the 17th century and who is widely regarded today as the greatest master of the haiku, and Li Po, who lived from 702 to 762, one of the most celebrated Chinese poets of the Tang dynasty. So what interested me in his approach to translation was the fact that Mahon did not actually speak most of the languages he translated. Okay. He did, of course, know the classical languages, such as Latin, particularly the works of thinkers and poets like Horace and Ovid, which he had studied at the Royal Belfast Academical Institution called INST during his youth. So INST is a very famous grammar school in Northern Ireland in Belfast. And you have many other famous Irish poets, such as Seamus Heaney, for instance, or Michael Longley, who went to INST at the same time as Mahon, and they were friends all together. And, well, they learned Latin, Greek, and French. So then, what about Japanese or Chinese or Hindi? He has even translated from Hindi. And in the preface to one of his collections, collection of translations, which is called Echoes Grove, published in 2013, which he later republished in his essay collection called Red Sails, which is here, in 2014, he mentions the scholars and existing translations on which he relied when producing his own. So I had my answer then. So of course, he did not know Japanese or Chinese, but he had read translations, anthologies, which had been published into English of translations of Matsuo Basho or Lippo or Indian poetry. I would quote his essay which is entitled Poetry in Translation in Red Sails. My own versions, looking to recreate the spirit and employing many extraneous devices, belong in another category, that of poems adapted from their originals, relying, for instance, on the scholarly work of A.C. Graham for the Tang poets. So this was the anthology, so of course I had to look a little bit, and I found the anthology that he had used to write his own translation, so to speak. So this was for the Chinese poems of the late Tang dynasty, and on that of Lucy Rosenstein for the Indian ones. So Lucy Rosenstein's published this anthology on the Nai Kavita, so the new poetry in Hindi. So this is contemporary Indian poetry. He said that he relied on the works of those two scholars to make something not only, I hope, fairly respectable, but also readable, and perhaps rereadable in a different language. I've taken many liberties in the hope that the results will read almost like original poems in the English, while allowing their sources to remain audible, end quote. So in his translations, or rather adaptations, as he himself prefers to call them, Marion deliberately follows what you know now Jérôme referred to as the Ciceronian method, which grants the translator freedom and even a slight degree of impertinence. And this is Marion again, about this kind of impertinence. Seen from one point of view, there's a peculiar impertinence involved in this kind of thing. But to borrow a form of words from Elizabeth Bowen, a very famous Irish novelist, who am I that I shouldn't have a go? A poem, says Yves Bonnefoy, isn't the end in itself, but the meaning it bears. Let's not, he says, make a fetish of the printed page. Released from fixed form, which is merely its trace, the first attention or intuition can be tried out anew in another language. And on this second journey, we have the right to be ourselves. And this second journey is translation. So we have the right to be ourselves in translation. Poetry, in other words, isn't always lost in translation, even if the poetry is. Something, the thought, survives. So I think this is a very interesting reflection on the poetry in translation and how you can translate poetry. It isn't always lost in translation. And so if we return to Roman Jakobson and his famous essay on linguistic aspects of translation that I mentioned again and again, we may observe that Marion adopts a more, let's say, optimistic stance regarding the translatability of poetry. Because for Jakobson, poetry is fundamentally and irreducibly bound to its linguistic material, and leading him to conclude quite pessimistically that, I quote, poetry is untranslatable. This was Roman Jakobson's point of view, especially due to the central role of wordplay and paronomasia. Yet, Jakobson, nevertheless, as those of you who've attended my classes, he, at the very end, offers a potential way forward, and I'll quote him again. Only creative transposition is possible, in poetry, I mean. Either intralingual transposition from one poetic shape into another, or interlingual transposition from one system of signs into another. Or finally, intersemiotic transposition from one system of signs into another, e.g. from verbal art into music, dance, cinema, or painting. So what Jakobson terms creative transposition, the American poet Robert Lowell calls imitations, and Derek Mahon calls adaptations. So the question is, which term then should we adopt? So to conclude, let us consider Marin's own adaptation or translation of Paul Valéry's celebrated poem, Le Cimetière Marin. So I shall read his translation of Le Cimetière Marin by Paul Valéry, and then his reflections on the title he chose to translate the title, Le Cimetière Marin. So I hope it's here, or maybe it's in the other one. Maybe it's in adaptations. Yes, the seaside cemetery. So I shall not read the whole poem because it's very long, but just one page so you can have an idea. The seaside cemetery, from the French of Paul Valéry, so even the use of the preposition from is interesting. Inspired by the Mont Saint-Clair cemetery in Paul Valéry's hometown of Sète, southwest France, Le Cimetière Marin was begun in July 1917 and first published in 1920. A tranquil surface where a spinnaker moves flickers among the pines, among the graves. Objective noon films with its fiery glaze a shifting sea, drifters like dipping doves, and my reward for thought is a long gaze down the blue silence of celestial groves. When, as now, light freezes above the gulf, a gem revolving in its radiant gleam, such many-faceted and glittering foam that great peace seems to extend itself, those clear-cut artifacts of the continuum, time and knowledge, take the shape of a dream. Wide open vault and chaste shrine to Athene, deep reservoir of calming, shining money, like an eye, the supercilious water structure lies somnolent beneath its burning veils. And my soul, silence too, is architecture, a golden hoard roofed with 1,000 tiles. Temple of time I breathe when I breathe in. To this high point I climb and I feel at home, ordering all things with a seaward stare of circumspection. And as my supreme offering to the gods, the serene glare sows on the depth an imperious disdain. But even as fruit consumes itself in taste, even as it translates its own demise deliciously in the mouth where its form dies, I sniff already my own future smoke, where light sings to the ashen soul the quick change, starting now on the murmuring coast. Under this clear sky, it is I who change. After so much conceit, after such strange decadence, but bursting with new power, I give myself up to these brilliant spaces. On the mentions of the dead, my shadow passes, reminding me of its own ephemeral hour. A sole exposure to the solar torches I can endure, and the condign torches of the midsummer's pitiless bronze light. And though submission show a midnight face invisible in daytime, to that bright presence I concede the superior place. So, what about this title, The Seaside Cemetery, pour le cimetière marin? As Marion explains himself in his preface, it is not exactly the same. So I'd like to ask you, before I give you his answer, could you tell me perhaps why this is not the same, and also what are the connotations implied in the seaside cemetery instead of le cimetière marin? And perhaps you could offer another translation, possibly. Yes? Mm-hmm. Alors, oui, il y a cette possibilité-là, tout à fait. Hein. Seaside, en anglais, c'est plutôt au bord de la mer, d'accord. Le cimetière marin, ça peut en effet être dans la mer. Est-ce que vous pouvez me donner des exemples de cimetières marins? Oui, Alison? Oui, par exemple, hein, les épaves, tout à fait. Hein, les épaves, quoi d'autre? Qu'est-ce qu'on peut retrouver dans la mer et au fond des mers et qualifié de cimetière marin? Oui. Oui, exactement, hein, des cimetières marins d'animaux, tout à fait, hein, exactement. Je parlais tout à l'heure de la bibliothèque d'Alexandrie. Il y a eu des fouilles sous-marines, par exemple, hein, qu'on a retrouvé l'emplacement. Il y avait des plans quand même qu'on a pu voir, où on a pu retrouver l'endroit à peu près où se situait la bibliothèque d'Alexandrie, et on a retrouvé beaucoup d'artefacts, beaucoup d'objets extraordinaires lors de fouilles sous-marines de la ville d'Alexandrie. Hein. Donc oui, il y a toutes ces connotations-là dans le cimetière marin qu'il n'y a pas dans Seaside. Hein, ça, je suis d'accord avec vous. Il y a quelque chose d'autre aussi, et Marion va en parler après, qu'il y a dans dans Seaside. Bon, moi, je pense à une chanson, par exemple, en anglais, mais je ne sais pas si vous la connaissez. Enfin, c'est une chanson classique. Hein, ça vous rappelle pas quelque chose? Oh, I like to go by the seaside. Non, personne connaît cette chanson? Ah, c'est une chanson qui remonte au début du XXe siècle. Hein, donc ça fait Oh, I like to go beside the seaside, etc., etc. Hein. Alors, il y a un côté, ce que je veux dire, c'est qu'il y a un côté léger hein, dans l'adjectif seaside en anglais, qui n'est absolument pas évidemment approprié ici, hein, puisque Valérie parle d'un cimetière. D'accord. Et donc seaside, c'est vrai que, et c'est ce que Marion va dire un moment hein, après, il y a une connotation légère, une connotation d'amusement presque, hein, quand on va à seaside, to go to the seaside, et c'est ce qu'il y a dans cette chanson, en anglais, hein, chanson vraiment classique. Ben, on y va pour se baigner, pour jouer, acheter des glaces aux enfants, etc. etc. Hein. Bon. Donc on pourrait se dire, mais pourquoi il a traduit par seaside? C'est pas la bonne connotation, hein, ce n'est pas approprié. Bon. Donc ça c'est pour seaside. Cemetery. Hein, pour le cimetière. On aurait pu choisir un autre terme en anglais, lequel? Il y a un autre terme en anglais pour cimetière. Oui, Alison? Oui, graveyard, absolument, hein, graveyard. Et alors, est-ce que vous avez une idée? Et c'est d'ailleurs le terme qu'un poète anglais très célèbre qui s'appelle Cecil Day-Lewis a utilisé pour traduire le poème de Valérie. Non, il a traduit par The Graveyard by the Sea. D'accord? Traduction intéressante. Alors, qu'est-ce qu'il y a dans graveyard, peut-être, qui ne convient pas tout à fait pour le cimetière marin? Enfin, je ne sais pas si vous connaissez le poème de Valérie. Il faut peut-être, je ne sais pas, connaître un petit peu. Ou même avoir été... Alors, petit indice, c'est à 7. Non, alors, je vais vous montrer. Donc, voilà le cimetière marin. Hein, où repose Paul Valéry, d'ailleurs, puisqu'il avait choisi. Il parle de lui, hein, dans la traduction que je vous ai lue de Marion, il parle de lui et de sa future tombe. Donc, c'est un cimetière absolument extraordinaire. Donc, en fait, il faut monter en haut de la colline, hein, et il surplombe la mer. Donc, on a une vue vraiment fabuleuse. Et alors, quelles sont, quand on voit cette image, évidemment, il y a les tombes, donc une image assez sombre, mais quand même, qu'est-ce qui domine si on regarde cette photo? Bon, c'était pas la meilleure qualité que j'ai pu trouver, mais quand même, you get the idea. Est-ce que ce cimetière évoque seulement la mort, d'après ce que vous voyez? Alors après, il faut lire le poème, mais bon, qu'est-ce que ça évoque aussi? Qu'est-ce que ça inspire? Il y a des cimetières plus ou moins beaux quand même, vous pensez pas? C'est plutôt quand même un bel endroit. Hein, voilà. Donc, c'est ce que dit Marion aussi après, hein, c'est-à-dire qu'il dit que Donc, il évoque la traduction de Cecil Day Lewis, donc The Graveyard by the Sea, et il dit la chose suivante: It's too somber for such a paradoxically lively piece of work, except for those who dislike the word symmetry. And again, not quite right topographically. Puisque il précise bien que en fait, ce cimetière est appelé le cimetière marin. Alors, je ne sais pas s'il y en a qui sont allés à Sète ou pas. Non, qui connaissent Sète. Si vous êtes allé à Sète, c'était peut-être pour vous baigner, pas pour aller voir les cimetières. Mais en fait, c'est par rapport, il y a un autre cimetière à Sète, mais qui, lui, est plutôt dans les terres. D'accord? Donc, il s'appelle le cimetière marin pour le distinguer de l'autre cimetière qui existe à Sète. D'accord? Donc, il dit, as those who have ever set foot in Sète will know, Valéry's title is what the place is commonly called to distinguish it from the other, the landward one. His is the seaside cemetery. It's not on the shore exactly, but up a hill above the shore. And as you can see, it looks out over the sea. Its proper name is the Cimetière du Mont-Saint-Clair. There are hundreds buried there, including sailors, fishermen, and their families. Also Valéry himself, a son of the town, with an inscription from his poem, Ô récompense après une pensée, qu'un long regard sur le calme des dieux. So you can think that le calme des dieux is the sea. Okay? So, to come back just to the seaside, the problem with seaside. So, as Marion puts it, there were those, myself among them, who queried my title, The Seaside Cemetery, which sounds glib in English and seems to suggest somewhere right on the shore or behind a beach, as you pointed out, with kiddies and ice cream. It's a tricky one. So, the graveyard by the sea, as he said, too somber for such a paradoxically lively piece of work, okay? And then he adds quite funnily, then we could have said perhaps the Marine cemetery full of Marines, the soldiers, the American soldiers? No. So the Marine cemetery wouldn't have been an appropriate translation, okay? So, to conclude, the seaside cemetery is, of course, not an exact equivalent of le cimetière marin. But in Marion's own words, and I'll finish on this, I quote, the poetry hides in its language of origin and is not finally translatable. We can only approximate. So this is another possibility that Jacobson had not anticipated. That is to say, translation of poetry as approximation. Thank you very much for your attention and see you next week.